think I'll just try to power. Thank you. I think I'll try to just power through till 11:30. So yeah, so I'm not even following my my deck anymore, but that's fine. I think this has been a little bit more freewheeling, and I kind of like it. I would like to just work a little bit at splitting up these components that we've got here and start adding a little more functionality. So we already have this component, you know, and as the question was like, you know, is it worth taking out this click function on this button? And that's a good way to start thinking about the ways your markup works here in React, because you could theoretically have a React app that is just one gigantic file. You don't have to break things up at all. Again, React is very unopinionated. It will kind of let you do whatever you want. And there are many ways to do things that are functional, but maybe not great for you, the developer, if you have to make changes later. So it tries to make it very easy for you to split things up. And that is going to be most of the work you do, actually, for most of the apps you do. Once you get the hang of it, once the basics are down, building an app becomes really a question of, how do I organize this? How do I make this make sense? Like, you know how to do everything, but where do I put this? Where do I put this? You know, these two things do this same thing. Should I put that into a separate file that they both talk to, or does that make it more complicated? Those become the questions that you ask, and particularly the places where you got to work closely with anyone you're collaborating with to make sure it makes sense to all of you, and you're using a pattern that's easy enough to follow, easy to onboard new people. And always remember that, like, even if you only are doing a project by yourself, you still need to deal, you know, you still need to think about you a year from now, coming back to your code, who is essentially a new developer. Like, there will be a point where you completely forget every decision you made, and you'll be baffled by your own code. So you need to try to work with your future self to try to make it as easy for them as possible to jump back in. So luckily, React is great for that. And this flexibility can be awesome for letting you kind of create your own structures. So yeah, here we have our one piece of real functionality here. The one thing that's we're interacting with is this button. And we can take out the click function, but we could also take out the entire button and just make it into a new component. So let's give that a shot. And I'm just going to use everything in the same file right now, since it's still a fairly small app. Eventually, maybe we move this into its own file. Maybe this button gets used on multiple screens. You know, assume it does something a little more useful than just incrementing a counter. But yeah, this is a common thing you're going to run into in React. Like, I have this piece of markup that I want it to be its own thing, so I'm going to make it into a new component. So the way we do that is, let's create a new function, and we'll call it counter button. And we'll put it up here at the top. And so since I'm creating the function in this file, anything in this file is going to be able to use this. I don't need to worry about other files right now because there aren't any. If we did have other files, we need to start worrying about doing things like exporting it so it could be available to other files, but that's not something you need to concern yourself with right now. So what I'm going to do first off is, let's just take the button right here. I'm going to pull it out and put it into the counter button. So now it's important that the function has to return this. I can't just put it in here like this, or it won't work. I actually wonder if that'll give me an error, will it? No, it doesn't give me an error. Yeah, this is Vite. I don't know if this is a Vite thing or if React has changed, but it used to give you more errors in the screen. Okay, we do get errors in the console. Yeah, right away, whole bunch of errors here. Now, this is all because I pulled this functionality out without even thinking about what I'm doing. I've just like ripped it out. So now it's confused. So first off, it doesn't know what count is. This is a problem, right? This is the same problem we had when I pulled this function out before. So it also doesn't know what onClick is, because that function still lives in app. So one thing I can do is I can pull this out, and I can put it in here, and I can pull out count as well and put it in here. And those errors should at least go away. Let's try reloading here. Okay, now I don't get any errors at all, but you'll also notice there's no button. Like, where'd it go? It's completely gone. That's because I didn't return anything. This function is now returning undefined, which I really thought would give you an error, but apparently doesn't. Maybe this is a React if thing. We're returning basically nothing. Undefined and null are not the exact same things. Usually React will encourage you to just return null when you want nothing to be there. Like, maybe sometimes there's a button that says log out because you're logged in. Sometimes there's nothing because you're not logged in. That's an example. So when you do that, it usually wants you to return null, which is kind of like you have decided this is nothing, versus undefined, which means, well, just nothing got returned. There was nothing done, so it's undefined. This is a JavaScript thing, not a React thing, and it's weird. But anyway, so we didn't actually return this. That's the problem. So what we need to do here is we don't need to return these two lines, 6 and 7 here, because those are just doing some of our logic. We need to return the markup right here. So I'm going to return this. And you can put these parentheses around it if you have multiple lines. And something here, oh, it's just, okay, this is not doing any auto formatting. I'm used to have my projects being set up to do auto formatting, so I'm like lazy. If you have multiple lines of JSX though, and you want to put them in between these open parentheses here, and that'll allow you to lay them out like this, so they're nice and pretty. And now we should actually get something. Oh wait, no, we're not getting anything. Still not getting anything. Why aren't we getting anything? Well, we have this function, but it's not being used. The thing is calling this function. There's just an empty space here where the button used to be, and the app function is being called because we're exporting that, and that that index or the main JSX file here is using the app function. So we still see that on screen. Something somewhere is rendering app, but just creating a component, if you don't render it, none of this code ever gets called. It just sits there waiting, essentially. So how do we call it? Well, this is a function, and like you might think of it like, this kind of a function here in JavaScript. But since this is JSX, when you have a component, you don't really call it. You put it in here just like it's an HTML tag. So what we're going to do is we're going to put counter button, and you can see my little, just like that. And it fits in there in the mark, just like any other HTML tag. And now we go back here, it's back, and it works exactly the same way. Because now count is in here, the on-click function's in here, all the stuff it needs is here. And this is great. So now this whole app is just markup. Like, I know I want the counter button here, but the counter button deals with its functionality. I don't need to deal with it. It's all self-contained, and now I can move this. Now this I can use on multiple pages, and they'll each have their own button with its own count. And this can be great if that's what we want. It may or may not be what we want, but this is one of the really powerful things about React, is the way we can just like create these isolated bits of UI. So, and of course, and since it's just markup, it's easy to move it around the page. Let's say I want it underneath this, right? Instead of above and now it's below the text. Very easy to move things around. So if you have a complicated, like a dashboard with a whole bunch of these individual components that are all doing complex things, you can easily split them up into separate components, and then all you're doing is just arranging them in different places. So every component can carry its own state, yes. When you use state here, essentially this use state hook means I want to use state wherever I'm calling this. So now that this state, count and set count only exist inside counter button. Now this is key, right? Now, what if I wanted to use this state somewhere else, right? Like right now, this is great. I just want markup here. I don't want to deal with what the count is. But what if I want this code to show up here? Like I want count times to show up somewhere in my other code. Now I get errors because I'm trying to access something I no longer have access to. I see a hand.
Yesterday in the our lecture, we were talking in the text about the wisdom or philosophy of how to organize your apps. So we wondered how many different functions there can be in one file. What are your thoughts about organizing a complex application and having many functions available?
Again, it really depends on like the project and the team I'm with, more than like I like to take that approach rather than like these are the rules and I always follow them. So try to figure out something that works for everybody. But I think a good general pattern is if a component is shared in multiple like views, like multiple places, not on one screen, but like let's say you have like a login and a log out button is a great example. That's something you probably will always have in your header or something, right? In a typical app. That's the kind of thing that should exist in its own file, and other things should import that. Whereas like, let's say I have like this counter button, and this is only specific to one particular thing I'm doing in the app. I think it's fine to move it into its own component, but I'd probably keep it in the same file, partly also as a sign to anyone else who's coming on board. Like try to think like, if I came into this app and I knew nothing about it, how would I figure out what's working? And hopefully you have like a whole bunch of documentation you wrote and you have tests and you have all this great stuff that can onboard somebody, but a lot of times you don't have that. So at the very least, try to make your code make sense. And it's like, if this is only in this file and it's not exported from this file, I know it's only used here. So it's a great sign of like someone did this as an organizational choice, but they are also clearly signifying that like this doesn't need to get used elsewhere. So I would say like a little, usually in most apps, I'll do a little of both. I will create components that only exist in a file, but there's multiple components. I'll create, you know, stuff that gets split up into multiple files. But yeah, I just trying to keep it consistent, I think, is also the important thing, more than anything else. Like just because it's very easy to like break your own rules all the time. And again, React's not going to stop you from doing anything. Again, you could have one gigantic file. You could have 100 files with one line of JSX in them and nothing else, and you know, like an export. And there's plenty of ways you can like shoot yourself in the foot if you're not careful. So yeah, again, a lot of learning React is learning stuff like that, learning how to build an app structure. So I managed to go and break things, which is great. Let's take a look at the error messages too, really quick, so you can get a feel for some of these errors, because it's really great to get to know your errors. You're going to see a lot of errors. So first off, the first thing it says, count is not defined. This is great. This is pretty obvious what's happening. And it'll actually tell me which line it's on. And oops, I'm not even using this. I'm just going to close this. So if I go back into my code, line 29, right down here, that's where I just changed, right? It's saying, hey, you asked for count, that doesn't exist. It's actually really nice that it's telling me that, because in JavaScript, if I just like start using a variable in normal JavaScript, it will just have a value of undefined. And it will, so if we were just doing flat out JavaScript here, this would say save to test HMR undefined times. And, or maybe it would just say nothing. I think it actually writes the word undefined. I can't remember. I guess I can try that out. So let's imagine that we have count here, but it's just undefined, right? Okay, so it actually shows nothing. It doesn't show anything at all, which is not very helpful, right? If I'm trying to figure out why something isn't showing up, is it because it's undefined? Is it because I'm never showing it at all? Like, this is where JavaScript gets confusing. So luckily React has come to the rescue here a little bit, and it is actually telling us, hey, you need to have a reference to this. We don't know what this is. It actually says this twice. I don't know why it says it twice. And oh, you know what? What's happening, I think, is multiple renders. The page must be re-rendering a few times, which it will do automatically, because remember, React is looking for changes, and will sometimes, you won't see it as a user, but it will actually re-render the same component multiple times. So we're only really seeing one error here. Even though it looked like a lot of different errors, there's really only one. So that can be deceptive. That's important to keep in mind. I see someone's having trouble with returning an object. So want to, Gabo SW, want to speak to that? Or not to put you on the spot, but I'm curious what that's an interesting message. Every time I tried to mess with a dictionary in my return, it didn't work. Yeah, you need to return markup that it understands. Oh, that's fine. So Gabo SW cannot talk, that's fine. But yeah, if you try to return just regular data, I mean, you can do that in a function, right? Like, let's say we're not returning this. Let's say I just want to return, you know, an object. It's like my object, and it contains the count in it, right? So now if I try to go back into here, it's going to break. Oh, it's still breaking on count. Let me remove that. I'm just going to comment that out. All right, so now we have a new error. This is a good error to get to know. Objects are not valid as a React child. I'm assuming that's what you're seeing. Yes, great. So the problem here is not the function. There's actually nothing wrong with this. This is a perfectly valid JavaScript function. The problem is trying to use it in JSX. JSX is specifically looking for more JSX to render. If I do this instead, like let's just log the results of that, and I just call counter button as a function, then now nothing is broken, and I actually do get that back. See, this is exactly what I just returned. Now I don't see anything now because I'm no longer returning JSX. I'm not returning anything that React knows how to render. I'm just returning data, which can be useful. Sometimes you'll take that data and then somewhere else in here, I would turn that into JSX and then render it. But yeah, the thing about a functional component, and it can be confusing, right? Because all this says is it's a function. There's nothing here telling me that this is specifically a React functional component. I just have to know that. This is where TypeScript comes in handy, because in that, which is like it's a type, it's a thing you lay on top of JavaScript that essentially starts explicitly telling you what different types of data you're working with, and it's really, really handy. It might be something you come across pretty soon. I don't know if you're going to get into it. It can be kind of complicated on its own, but if you get into JavaScript, if you want to get into React land, it's a really good thing to learn, because it can help eliminate that ambiguity. But yeah, if you want to show something in JSX, you need to return something that has, actual JSX in it, or you can return null, or I guess you can return undefined, but you can't return just like regular data. So that's what your issue was. So yeah, I'll just keep this like this. So getting back to this, so let's say I want this count to be available here though, right? And now I'm getting all these errors because it doesn't know what that is. How do I share these two? Well, I can move. There's a few different choices here, right? I have to decide where count lives. What component needs to actually know what the count is and what other components don't. In this case, I usually default to whatever is kind of the top level component, the parent component in this case, which is app. App is the one that's showing me counter button, not vice versa, right? So I think it would make the most sense to bring count back into app, and app now knows what count is because app needs to know this. Now this won't immediately work though, of course. Now I'm getting some other errors, right? Now I still get this count is not defined, except now it's on line 9, because up here in counter button, this doesn't know what count is. So how do I deal with this? Well, one way I can do it is I can just pass count in as one of the props. You've talked about props in state. So I can pass count in as a prop. Now the problem is this is going to start getting a little weird, right? So I put an object in here with a key called count. And now that's going to come in as part of the props for, here we go. So now my error goes away, right? However, you'll notice count is blank. And every time I click on it, the whole thing breaks. So now I got a problem, right? Like I'm still trying to set count when I click on it. Like it knows count is 0, right? And if I change the initial value of it, it will correctly show 100, or actually, well, it won't show it here because it's still not getting anything. The thing is, like, I need actually, why isn't it showing count? Because this isn't the way they used to work in classes is you had like a props object that would come through, and I'm actually a little surprised. Oh, right, I know why it's not showing
Don't
count.
you have to put it on 31? Okay.
Sorry.
Or speaking of line 21 or 31,
31.
are you not supposed to give count?
Right, I didn't pass count in, so count is undefined. I need to take count from here and pass it in. Okay, so now count is 100. Great, that's all well and good. But when I click on it, this breaks because set count is now not defined. It doesn't know what that is. That still lives in here. So I could pass in set count as well. This is one option, right? So now I'm passing in a prop called count and a prop called set count. And both of those go in just like this. The same way you pass in anything into a normal HTML tag, just goes right into here. So this is one way to do it. Okay, now let's refresh, get rid of all those errors, no errors. Cool, and now it works. And both of these things now know what this is. So this is one way to do it. Now at this point, counter button is kind of very closely tied to whatever it's attached to. So this is something to consider, right? There might be situations where you actually want counter button to know its own count. There might not. It's very subjective. But essentially, we're managing the state at the parent level, which is usually what you want to do, and we're just passing props into here. So in this case, like the counter button only knows to call count with what I've passed in. This might be a little confusing, but essentially like, count and set count don't really mean anything to counter button because they're props. The props come from elsewhere. It doesn't control them. It can't change them. I can't just change count to count +1 or something like that, because that wouldn't work. I see a hand.
Yeah, so you can use the child to change the state of the parent.
In this case, yes, because I'm passing in the setter. I'm passing in the function. So like I can pass in any function I want, essentially. The child only knows it's calling the function, though. That's the thing. It's not really changing the state. It is simply calling a function. Like I could change that function so that instead of set count, it's like, let's make a new function here, right? And we'll call it, my cool function. And in this, I can set count. Let's say this just sets count to 1,000, right? That's all it does. It doesn't actually count. It just sets that. And if I pass that into here instead of set count, let's see what happens. See, it changes to 1,000, and no matter how many times I click, it just stays at 1,000. So what's happening there? So counter button knows it's going to get a function called set count, right? It knows that when I click on the button, it's going to call set count with count +1. Now, it's passing in count +1 to my cool function, which takes nothing. Now, this is where JavaScript is very JavaScripty, right? In many languages, if you tried to do what I just did, it would say, hey, wait a second. No. You pass something into this and there's nothing there, right? It doesn't expect any parameters. So they would give me an error. It might not even compile. JavaScript, though, is like, okay, we're calling this and you pass some stuff in, but I don't care. Like, I'm just going to ignore it. And it just sets count to 1,000. So you have all this code here that's actually doing nothing. And you have no errors and no indication that that is happening. This is also where TypeScript comes in handy. TypeScript, it partly exists to solve these problems. In TypeScript, we would tell my cool function exactly what it was expecting. And when I tried to call it with something that looked different, TypeScript would underline this in red and say, hey, you're passing something in. It's expecting 0 arguments and it got 1 instead. What's going on? So that's one way. So I don't know if that answers your question, but essentially, like, it just goes to show that counter button is unaware of what the actual function of set count is. We're calling it that, so we know it is, but all counter button is like, okay, you clicked, I'm calling this, I'm passing in this data, I'm done. And then it just kind of washes its hands of the whole thing. So
does that change the state of the parent?
In this case, yes, but we could also have it do nothing, or we could have it just like log something, right? And then the state won't change at all, but we log hello. Basically, the parent is changing the state. I mean, in a sense, we're passing in the set count function. So yeah, that is talking to the state, but essentially the way that's probably best to think of it is like, we're just giving it a callback. You're supposed to call this like a callback function or a closure. Well, maybe not a closure. I don't know if you call it that, but essentially like a callback function, right? It's like, just call this function. Don't worry about what it does. Just do it. And then it'll just do that. And that's usually how you want your child components to behave. I mean, the whole point of use state of these hooks, of having this function at all, is in the old class-based days of React, when you would set a state and it was this object, and you could actually alter that state. It was just a JavaScript object that just lived in your component, and you could just say like count equals count +1. When you did that, it wouldn't update because React is looking for you to specifically call set state. It had like the class would have a set state function, and that would change what you wanted to change. But you were actually changing the value, so you're just doing it invisibly. So there was a lot of opportunity for error there. And I think the reason they use the hooks this way is like this is similarly like when I change state in the parent function, I'm not really changing state here either. I'm just calling this function that use state gave me. So the real state stuff is happening in React itself in use state. It is dealing with what's changing and what's not, and it's just passing that back to me. So it's essentially like done the logic we just did and keeping my component very simple-minded, just calling something, if that makes sense. but yeah, that's a big issue in React is like, yeah, managing state and managing and stuff like that, and who is responsible for what state. So it's good to try to make that like really be very thoughtful about where you're doing that. And I see there's another question regarding the hook. The count is the variable we initialized as some value in use state function, and set count is how we're going to be manipulating it. Yes, use state, yeah, it's just a built-in React function that gives you a variable and a way to set the variable, and it's essentially just like it passes those down to us, and we don't actually know what's happening behind the scenes. We just trust that it's doing that. And yeah, use state returns an array. Again, that's what we were doing there earlier with the when I showed you that alternate way of writing it out. Like it's like, give me an array. It's like use state. Give me this array that I want to call the first part of it count, and the second element set count. Cool. So I would love to give you guys a little time to try to do something on your own and just see how it goes. Just give you a little assignment. We'll just take about 10-15 minutes to do it. What I just want you to do is just do, assuming that you've done all this, we have this separate function of counter button. I want you to have counter button actually be counter buttons, have it contain 2 buttons, and one of them subtracts in addition to adding. And there's multiple ways to do this, so don't worry about getting it exactly right. I want you to play around a little bit and see how it goes. And if you have any questions, I'll just be hanging out here. Feel free to ask either in the chat or out loud. And let's just take the next 15 minutes to about 11:20. I'll check in along the way to see how people are doing with that. Sound good? Yeah, to reiterate, the goal is let's make an extra button inside of the counter button component that also counts down. Yeah. Okay, I'm seeing some people are already pretty done. So, but if people are still working on it, just give a shout so I know that you wouldn't copy a car. Yeah, it's interesting. Duplicating code is it's sort of officially not a great way to go about things, but you'd be amazed how often it is just the simplest and easiest solution. So we'll talk about a few different ways to solve this problem in a second. Is anybody still working? Are people still working on it? I want to make sure that I'm not just like, okay, cool. People are still working. All right. I want to make sure that everyone gets a chance to take a stab at it before we go through some options. And I think after that, I'll just open it up to just general questions for the rest of the time we have left. All right, we're at about the 10-minute mark. I know I said 15 minutes, but I do want to make sure we have time for any questions at the end. So I'm just going to kind of go through a couple options for this. And feel free to ask questions as we go. Hopefully I didn't break anyone's stride here. So I'm going to go back and set the count back to 0. Let's look again at our, oh, everything's broken. It's my, oh yeah, right, I got rid of my cold function. Okay. So say I want 2 buttons, right? There's a couple ways I could do this. I can think about adding another button to my external component. I can think about just duplicating that component and having like an add button component and a subtract button component, right? And I think the people were talking about just copying some code. That might have been the approach you took. So I could change counter button to add button, for example, and then just copy and paste make a subtract button. And instead of adding one to the count, it subtracts one to the count. And then down here, counter button no longer exists, so I would expect to see an error there. Yep. But I can change this to add button, and then copy this, make a subtract button. And now I have one that adds and one that subtracts. So that's probably by far the simplest way to do this. And there's an argument to be made that that's the right way to do it, especially when you just need to fulfill one task. The problem is here, like, let's say I want to change some of the text, right? Like, I don't want it to say what the count is. I want to have like a plus and a minus sign, so it's clear what's going on, what the difference is between these two buttons. So now this isn't so hard, but notice I just had to change, even though these have almost the exact same functionality, I just had to change two totally different components to get them in line with the same idea of the design. And right now, that's not a big deal. If you have a really complicated app, though, where these appear on a lot of different pages, and maybe you have 10 different components now doing the same thing, which could absolutely happen, this is going to start to get pretty onerous. So maybe we want to go back to the pattern we had before. I'm just going to use my handy undo tool here. I'm going to go back to my counter button. So we have one. What I can do is I can have a separate button here. And now I only have one component. So I'm copying the JSX here instead. And now this is going to be interesting too, because we're about to see another we'll see an interesting error here that'll be good for you to know. All right, so I'm just gonna use the words add and the words subtract. Now immediately I get an error here. This is something that actually you might see a lot of. It's going to tell me JSX expressions must have one parent element. This is the thing, you need to return JSX from this functional component, but you need to return one parent with JSX inside it. I don't know why it requires this, but it does. This is very important. The easiest way, yes, somebody says wrap that baby in a div. That's a great way to do it. You can also do what's called a fragment, which is just this open and close tag here with nothing in it. And that will apply no styling whatsoever. This is literally just something, it's kind of like a built-in hack for React that just lets me wrap these in one single thing and changes nothing else. These are really handy, pretty much just for that exact reason. So now I have add and subtract. Now these both add, of course, however, right? So I need to change the functionality. I'm passing in, I only have this one on-click handler here. So I can, this is probably where I don't want a separate function, right? I want it to be right here on the on-click handler for the button. So I can pull that back out. I've just copied and pasted what was in my little function back into the on-click handler on the button. And I can change this, set the count to -1. And I missed something. I have an extra one of these. Okay. So now the functionality between these actually says does what they say they do. And oh, fun! I made a I'm in an infinite loop here. What did I do? Cannot update a component while rendering a different component. Ah, I see what I did. This is another thing you're going to do all the time. Does anyone notice something funny about this on-click handler here? There's something missing. And that is that what I'm doing here is, so everything inside this, not quotes, but good guess, it's this, the little open brackets and then the arrow. Now, what's the difference between these two things? So we go back in. Am I still broken here? I can't tell if I'm actually still broken or if I just need to restart Chrome. I might just need to restart Chrome because I broke its mind.
I think it's the props that you're passing into it down in line, whatever. Actually, no, never mind. For some reason, it looks like it's not accessing count in the function.
Oh, I see. Well, that shouldn't give me an infinite loop, though. So I don't know what the local host thing is for this. Hang on. Oh, here we go. Pete and React. Okay. All right. Are we still broken? Okay, we're not. So that's exactly what I was talking about. That the automatic reload did not fix the infinite loop problem. So it looked like that thing was still happening, even though it wasn't. And in that case, I couldn't even refresh. I had to close the browser and open it again. But now this should work. Okay, great. This actually works. All right. So what is the difference between these two things? This is really key. Before, what I had in here was not this. What I'm passing in now is a function. Because that's basically what this means. It's like this is shorthand for a function. It does have some slight differences from this, but they're not really worth going into right now. But basically, like, this is a function. I'm giving it a function on click. So when I click, call this function. If I don't put this in front of it, what I'm passing in instead, the difference between these two, is I am just calling the function and then I'm passing in the results of that function, which is nothing. Set count doesn't return anything. It returns undefined. So on click is now undefined and the button will not do anything. But more importantly, every time I render this, I'm setting the count. It's just automatically setting the count every single time that this renders. And the problem with that is React is set up, like I said, to your data updates, your UI updates, right? Without thinking. Every time count changes in here, since count is being rendered here, the component will re-render. So what happens is I render counter button once, it calls set count and upgrades it by 1, which then changes count here, re-renders all of this, renders this again, sets it again, and infinite loop. And if I go back in here, you'll see again. And fortunately here, this tells me, like, this doesn't just lock up. I can see these error messages piling up. I know something is looping endlessly. If you do this in React Native, it will just crash, which is, so it's a little bit different. But yeah, very, very valuable thing to know that you did. So again, I'm probably gonna have to kill, let's see if I can do this. Yeah, it looks like it's not actually gonna, let's try to open that up again. Okay, so I've removed it back and I've put the function in just like before. So this can be a very, very easy mistake to make. I do it all the time. But it's very important to recognize that when you're passing in a callback, you're passing in something that you're expecting the component to call is very different from calling the function and then passing in the result. But very, very easy mistake to make. So this is one simple way to do it. The other thing I could do is, like, so now if I wanted to have a little more control over the logic that's going into counter button, I could also have an option to, rather than doing set count, we could just have an add function and a subtract function, for example. And then I could control it in the parent instead. Now this is going to yell at me because these don't exist, or it'll just do nothing. Actually, I think it will actually crash. Oh no, it just does nothing. Okay, so now here's the thing. So another little quirk of JavaScript, like I said, right? If you give things that they're not expecting or give them nothing, it will just try to carry on. So here I've said, all right, I'm expecting some props called add and subtract, and I'm going to tell this button on click to add and this button on click to subtract. Since I didn't define them down here, they come through as undefined. So I'm telling this button, hey, you have an undefined on click handler, and this button has an undefined one as well. Button is totally cool with that. It's fine with that being undefined. It won't give me an error. It just won't do anything. You'll also notice I passed in a prop that we're not using, this set count. And again, it's not being used here at all, but it doesn't care. I don't get any error messages, nothing happens. So this is another thing where TypeScript can help you out, because TypeScript would yell at me and say, hey, you're not using this prop in this component. But JavaScript itself will just try to kind of smile and keep carrying on like nothing is wrong. So it's good to remember that you will often have issues that don't throw errors. They just don't work. In this case, I just need to look closely, say, oh, I just never defined what those are. So let's add those in. And then what I can do here is I can use the set count here. So this is kind of nice because I'm sort of abstracting to counter button what I'm even passing in. It doesn't know it's setting a state at all. It just knows that it's getting something kind of function that's supposed to add something and some kind of function that's supposed to subtract something. It doesn't know what they do. It will just call them if I press the button. So what I can do here is just do count +1 here. And again, see what I'm doing? I'm doing it again. I'm not sending in a function. I'm calling the function and setting in the result. So I don't want to do that. And I'm going to do the same thing with subtract. Sorry, I'll move this window here. And if I go back in here, looks like this works. Great, still works. So these are just two different ways to do the exact same thing. And this is kind of what I'm talking about. React will let me do both. They're both valid. There's a good argument for either of them. You know, in this case, like the nice thing about this is counter button is now very simple. It's just, it knows it actually doesn't even need count anymore because it's not showing anything. So I can take that out. Counter button literally just needs one function that adds and one function that subtracts. It doesn't know what they do. It doesn't care. And I can deal with, like, if this is a really complicated visual button with a lot of animations or something, I can put all that stuff in here and not have to worry about the functionality, and this handles it instead. I see a lot of quote chat stuff that I missed, so hopefully I'm not running past anybody right now. But yeah, essentially this is just one way to do it. The other way, though, there was an argument for it where, like, I don't want my parent component here to have to deal with the exact logic about whether we're adding or subtracting. That should be the button's responsibility because it knows what it's doing. Maybe it's doing a complicated mathematical thing and I want to put all that in there. So I move it in there instead. There's, again, reasons why you might want to do both approaches, but the cool thing is how flexible React is. And that's also, you know, it's a blessing and a curse, I guess, right? Because, like, you can do whatever you want, and you are free to sometimes do things inconsistently or in ways that confuse other people you work with or your future self. So you just have to be kind of thoughtful about the way you put things together. Any questions on that? We're almost at 11:30 now. I can hang out a little bit longer, maybe to like 11:45, if people want to just ask general questions too. They don't have to be React specific. It could be about software development in general. I know a lot about
question about React. I was wondering if you could talk about the difference between use state and use ref.
Yeah, that's a great question. So let's say we want to do this with a ref instead of state. It's kind of similar, but with one really key difference. So let's say count is this, right? And now we no longer have a set count, or I can make a set count, all right? So that I don't have to break this. This is just looking for a function called set count. It doesn't know what it is, so I can create my own set count. So let's say we instead of using use state, we use this built-in React thing called use ref. And in set count, I take in a count. I'm going to call this just number so we don't get confused, because that's valid. I can use count twice, since then count just, anyway, long story. Let's not get confused. So the value the parameter this takes in, the argument that set count takes in, we're just going to call num. And we'll just say count current equals num. So a ref gives back an object which has a parameter called current, and that is the current value of that ref. Now a ref also is it's a variable that can change and can change stuff that's going on in your component. However, it has one key difference. One thing is that it breaks. Oh, I need to import use ref. Hang on. So I didn't import use ref, so I got an error there. And it still doesn't like that. Oh, whoops, I'm not returning anything. Actually, wait, why is it giving me that error? That's interesting. Oh, I think I see what's going on. I was still passing. Nope, that's not the problem. I'm not sure what it's trying to render here. Oh, I know it. Here it is. So similar to that issue we had before where it was yelling at me about the object, count is no longer a number. Count is an object which contains count.current, which is a number. And I tried to just put count right into the JSX here, and it yelled at me. It said, no, you can't put an object in there. You gotta take something out of it. So I need to change this value to current. Let's see if that fixes everything. Yes, great. Okay. Now here's the thing though. So it's 0, right? And if I set it initially as 100, it should say that correctly, right? When I add and subtract, nothing happens. The reason for that is when a ref updates, it doesn't re-render the component. So this can be really valuable sometimes because you know that thing that happened before where I created an infinite loop. If there's a situation like that where you need to be updating something, but you don't want it to render again because that's going to trigger something, then a ref can help you out. You can have a value that is updatable and you can use normally, but that doesn't trigger that re-render automatically. In this case, we don't want it because we do want to see that value, but there are many instances where you do want that in fact. So that's the difference. I see somebody asked if you can save this value in like a storage key. Like if you want to save it in like the session data of the browser. Yeah, you can do that. Because yeah, if I refresh this, for example, if I go back to what we had before. So we're going back to using state. And that should be correct, right? Okay. So now this works. If I refresh this, then yeah, the whole app is now reloading. It's a single page app, like we said, so everything is contained within this one sort of page load of the browser, and when I refresh, everything goes away. So yeah, there are ways you can use the local session stuff and things like that to store variables if you need to. Frequently, like in real life, you're probably not storing anything really in the React session itself like this. You're probably talking to an API and updating some backend data, which you're then reloading. So it's very rare that your front end really needs to actually handle any large amount of data at any given time. But when you're just starting out and playing around with it, yeah, that's something you could potentially do. So someone asks, we've only seen one page or one app.jsx. What if you have more than one page? How would you start to create this? So there's a few ways to do that. The most popular that I know of is React Router, which essentially lets you handle navigation between pages that looks like you're going from page to page in the same way that you would, you know, I'm not sure what it's doing under the hood, if it's like capturing those navigation events and just like preventing the browser from actually loading a different page, or if it's somehow using session data to store stuff from page to page. But basically it will make it so you'll see the URL changing. You can go to, you know, mywebsite.home or /home/profile/ whatever. And you'll go to these things, and then React Router will know what page you're on, and you can organize your app that way. As a way to, the user has no idea that they're not going from page to page, that they're only sitting on one page, but you have control then over everything that happens. So generally, yeah, you'll use a tool like that as a way to navigate from place to place. I see a hand.
So there was a question starting off talking about a single page website. Are single page websites generally the expression of a lot of JavaScript usage, or where does that come from? Because it's kind of interesting idea. Can you construct a, you know, many pages from the code from one page or something like that?
Yeah, it's JavaScript doing it. Yeah, like I said, I don't like when React Router does it, I don't know exactly what it's doing. Because you used to have to like write JavaScript that would actually capture that any browser action, like a reload or a back or forward, and try to like do something else with it. This was super complicated and annoying. So React and React Router can eliminate those for you. And there's other options besides React Router too. I think that's just the only one I've really used. But yeah, essentially, like ideally you shouldn't have to think about that at all. Like it shouldn't matter to you. Just that, you know, you are persisting some data from page to page, regardless of whether the browser is actually reloading or not. Anyone have any other questions? And they can be as broad as you want. Doesn't have to be React specific.
How sorry, how do you when you're creating a div, when you're returning a div, can you also return a class name in that div?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, if you want, like, for example, so I use that fragment here, but let's say we want to do a div instead for our counter button, right? And I want this to have a border or something, right? So I'll call it, bordered. And then here in my CSS, I can create bordered and do border, 1 pix solid. I'm not going to see that actually. Let's make it yellow. Oh, wait, that's not yellow at all. Yeah, like here's an example, right? Doesn't look very good, but let's say I wanted to actually, change something about that. Anything returning in a component is just, it's the same thing as like having this right in the JSX here. So it can follow all the exact same rules, use CSS the same way, anything like that. You're not limited by that. I see someone asked a question about Django. I've never used Django, but I know it's not unlike Rails. So React is, unlike Django, it has no built-in backend at all. So we start with app.jsx, and from there we can embed, like a router that handles multiple different pages essentially, or we could just have we could just load different views depending on what the user is doing. We have all sorts of options there. But ultimately, you would need to connect it to some kind of a backend, like Django would be an example, through an API where we would make calls to it and essentially fetch all the data we need, update all the data we need, and then use that to populate whatever's on the screen. And that can be anything at all. There are some ways to probably more easily connect specific, I'm sure Django has some specific package that connects it to React, or you can set up a project that way, because I know Rails does that. But you also don't have to. The nice thing is that this kind of makes these totally different concerns. You have a whole back end that deals with data, and it really only deals with data. And then you have a front end that deals with, views and the user manipulating and seeing the data and changing it and all that stuff. And they're like their own worlds, which can make things actually a lot easier for you. I see another hand.
So what if the result of the addition was even, or if it was odd, where would you change the class name? How would you change the color of the button if the result was even or odd?
That's a great question. Let's try it. Let's do so when there's a few different ways we could do that, but you want to change both buttons to the same color? Let's just say they're okay. Let's say that it's green if it's even and it's red if it's odd. Okay. So what I'll do here is I'm going to create a couple of different classes. This is one way to do it. You don't even need to use CSS necessarily. And we'll just call even and odd. So this is just normal CSS. I'm just going to change the background color to green, and this background color will be red. And now back here, so currently counter button no longer gets the count, but let's bring it in. And I'm still passing it in here, so we're good there. And let's just do a quick check. And this is everything above this return block is just JavaScript. So I'm just doing regular JavaScript logic here to try to figure out if this is even or odd. So I'm going to say, is even. Make a new variable called is even, and I will check count modulo 2 equals 0. I think this is how you do this. Oh, sorry, equals 0. I think this is how you do it. This is like a thing that checks for the remainder when you divide by something.
So
Sorry, I heard something.
yeah, I believe so.
Cool. And so essentially, and now let's what I would probably do is take the class that I want. I'll call it button class. And I'll say, okay, if this is even, and I'm going to do what's called a ternary operator here. You know what? I'm not going to do that because that's too complicated. Let me just do it this way. If is even, I'm going to do a let class equals even, right? Or I'll say it's odd. So by default, I have a class that's let's call it dynamic class. So by default, this is odd. But if is even is true, I can say dynamic class is going to be even, right? So now I have this variable that says either odd or even. And then what I can do here is I can just set the class name. Actually, I don't even need to do it for the button. I can do it for the whole background here. And instead of having a string value there, I'm just going to put in dynamic class. Let's see if that worked. Cool. So this is where JSX really excels, right? Like I can do all this logic here, and this can be as complicated as I want it to be. It can involve external data and APIs and whatnot. By the time it gets down here, all I need to do is just pass in this variable, and this will just update with whatever I want, basically, as soon as the data changes. And that's the kind of thing that React makes super easy, because doing what you just described in like jQuery would have been really annoying back in the olden days, or before jQuery, when you just had to do this all manually, which was awful. Does that make sense?
Yes, that's great. Thanks.
Cool. All right, well, we're heading up on 11:45 here. So yeah, if there's any last questions anyone thinks of after this, I think you have my email address. I'm also on LinkedIn, and I don't believe I'm on the Code Platoon Slack anymore. So probably email or something like that would be the best way to get in touch with me. But yeah, I'm happy to answer any further questions if something comes to you later on. And yeah, it can be broader than just React. If you're interested in mobile development, I'm happy to send people resources and stuff like that. Yeah, you've been great. Thank you for asking so many questions too. This was awesome. I really prefer to do more questions than anything else in these kind of things. So thanks a lot. Appreciate you having me.